Hello, I'm Lucie Skeaping, and my talk focuses on the stage jig in its historical context in the early modern period, and in particular on its music. For the past 19 years, I've presented the Early Music Show on BBC Radio 3, and as an early music practitioner, I've specialised in the performing of 17th century English broadside ballad repertoire with my ensemble, the City Waits. And I then produced an edition of broadside ballads for Faber Music in 2006. More recently, my book Singing Simpkin and Other Bawdy Jigs, co-authored with Roger Clegg, was published by Exeter University Press. And I'm going to be talking about the background of some of the 9 surviving jig texts that feature in the book and how I went about researching and identifying the tunes to which they may have been sung. This is going to be followed by a short performance of the jig Singing Simpkin, which was filmed at King's College London as part of their What You Will Shakespeare Festival 2016. So what exactly do we mean by the word jig? Well, nowadays people tend to associate the word jig with a dance, usually Irish or Scottish, and with a bouncy 6/8 or 9/8 rhythm. You may also recognise it as a movement in a Baroque instrumental suite, usually the final movement, and also in that triple time diddly 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 rhythm. But in the Tudor and Stuart era, the term jig had a broader meaning. If you visited one of the London playhouses at the end of the 16th and early 17th century to see a play by Shakespeare or one of his contemporaries, the chances are that at the end of the play a number of performers would come onto the stage to present a short drama, usually featuring dance and comedy, mainly in rhyming stanzas and often entirely through-sung to popular tunes of the day. These jigs, or dramatic jigs as we might call them, could be bawdy, libellous and farcical. Those that have survived generally have plots that revolve around sexual rivalry, disguising, adulterous intrigue, and the foisting of babies on men who didn't beget them. Several feature a plebeian underdog, a serving man or a country clown who manages to win out against rivals who outmatch him in social status, wealth, strength, and brains. Dramatic jigs could be performed by travelling players on makeshift stages set up in fairs, marketplaces and tavern courtyards. They featured stock characters that everyone could relate to, such as country bumpkins, faithless wives, cuckolded husbands, serving wenches, blustering soldiers and city bully boys. Even a couple of foolish constables turn up in one of them, all of whom brought to the stage remnants of the popular traditions of subversion, anarchy and misrule that can be found in earlier entertainments such as morality plays, court farces and balladry. In the playhouse, a jig would usually be performed as an afterpiece, perhaps a bit of light relief to send the audience home happy after watching one of the great tragedies. This is the frontispiece of a collection by Francis Kirkman entitled The Wits or Sport upon Sport, published in 1662, which contains several jigs along with other short comic plays. And you can see on the stage here some of the typical characters. Thomas Nash, a contemporary of Shakespeare, wrote of the quaint comedians of our time, when the play is done, do fall to rhyme. Ben Jonson talked of something being as ordinary as a jig after a play. And another of Shakespeare's contemporaries, John Marsden, noted how the jig is called for when the play is done. We don't know exactly how the transition from the end of the play to the jig actually happened, but it seems likely that once the stage was emptied of actors from the final scene of the main play, the jig performers, the comedians, bounced on as soon as it was feasible to do so. And it wasn't always left in the hands of the players. Audiences were quite capable of demanding a jig. Indeed, calling for a jig was a common practice in Elizabethan and Jacobean theatres. But by no means everyone was in favour of jigs. Nowadays they put at the end of every tragedy as poison into meat, a comedy or jig. The jig at the end of an interlude, wherein some pretty knavery is acted. And Thomas Dekker, another writer who overlapped with Shakespeare, put it like this: I have often seen, after the finishing of some worthy tragedy or catastrophe in the open theatres, that the scene after the epilogue hath been more black about a nasty bawdy jig than the most horrid scene in the play was. Some worried that the lewd content of the jigs might fire up lustful thoughts and encourage even old men to pay a visit to one of London's notorious brothels, which were situated just a stone's throw away from the playhouses on the south bank of the Thames. This was all too much for the authorities, and in 1612 the magistrates of Westminster saw fit to issue an order for suppressing of jigs at the end of plays by reason of certain lewd songs and dances used and accustomed at the playhouse, where divers cut-purses and other lewd and ill-disposed persons in great multitudes do resort thither at the end of every play many times, causing tumults and outrages. Although it seems that no one took much notice, because after a brief lull, things continued as before. I first began looking at jigs when I came across Charles Reade Baskerville's book, The Elizabethan Jig, published in 1929. It was the first, and until my own book was published, it was the only in-depth study of the genre, and it offered a variety of jig texts. I was keen to see how they might work in practice, though, so with my group I spent a week in Stratford with members of the Royal Shakespeare Company running a series of exploratory workshops, and then later on I ran a jig course for students at Dartington Hall International Summer School. This led to my making a CD recording of 5 of the jigs, as you can see there on the right, and then my book Singing Simpkin and Other Bawdy Jigs, co-authored with Roger Clegg, shown on the left, which built upon Baskerville's study. But while Baskerville had focused primarily on the texts and had only really touched on the music, the aim of our edition, my edition with Dr. Clegg, was to present the 9 surviving jigs fully reunited for the first time with their original tunes, so that they could be performed as far as possible as they might have sounded back in their day. However, it soon became clear that this task would require quite a bit of musical detective work. Here are some of the pages from jig texts, which, as you can see, survive in various conditions, either in print or manuscript, and I'll be focusing on some of them in more detail later. On the page, they mostly run between 10 to 25 minutes each, although in performance they probably would have been a bit longer with the addition of dancing, sword fighting, and lots of comic business and improvisation. But when it comes to their music, the tunes to which they were sung, they give very little away. The trouble is, with just one exception, none of them prints any musical notation. Some give us the names of the tunes to which they were sung, tunes which were already in circulation, and other jigs don't offer any tune names but just give instructions at certain points, like the tune alters or the tune changeth, which coincide with a change in rhythm and meter of the lyrics, which suggests the start of a new tune. But the majority of jig texts give absolutely no musical information at all, so sourcing and identifying the tunes was a very involved process. I'd like to give you a few examples of how I went about this. This is Francis' new jig as it appears on a broadsheet of around 1617, although it's probably related to an earlier lost jig that was listed in the Stationer's Register in 1595. And it seems to have been written by an actor called George Atterwell, a member of Lord Strange's company in the 1590s, because you can see his name printed at the bottom of the broadsheet, if you can just see that. The plot of the jig centres around the old bed trick. This is a much-used theme, of course, where an errant husband, Francis in this case, is tricked into sleeping with his own wife, believing her to be his mistress. Now, all 4 of its tunes are named, and you can see at the top that for the first one it says to the tune of Walsingham. Now, although there's no musical notation on the broadsheet, an earlier manuscript version of the same jig is reprinted by Andrew Clark in the Sherborne ballads of the early 20th century, along with notation for the first tune, Walsingham. At the opening of the jig, The song is sung by Bess. The Walsingham tune is sung by Bess, the farmer's wife, as she sits at home quietly singing to herself. As I went to Walsingham, to the shrine with speed, met I with a jolly palmer in a pilgrim's weed. Many in the jig audience would have recognised not only that tune but the lyrics of the opening verse as well, because they come from an old ballad, a popular love song about a pilgrim returning from the holy shrine of Walsingham in Norfolk. And by using it, the author of the jig seems to be making a satirical point, because as the song progresses, it soon becomes clear that this pilgrim or jolly palmer that Bess is singing about, far from being a God-fearing man of religion, is in fact an adulterer with designs on his neighbour's wife. The much-used Walsingham tune is also found in a variety of early compositions, including a keyboard setting by the great Tudor composer William Byrd in My Lady Neville's book of 1591. However, even then, it's not always straightforward, because these artful arrangements or settings of these simple popular tunes can be incredibly complex, full of musical decorations and extra notes and twiddles, so a certain amount of instinct is required to pick out what could have been the basic tune from all of those notes. But the majority of jigs don't give us any tune names. In fact, of the 9 jigs reproduced in my book Singing Simpkin, there are 42 places where a new tune or a change of tune is implied, but only 13 of them are actually named. But sometimes it is possible to find clues in the lyrics themselves. This is the first page of a jig called The Black Man, as it's published in Francis Kirkman's new edition of Wits or Sport Upon Sport of 1673, although again the jig almost certainly is related to an earlier lost version dating from the 1590s, and apologies for the rather low quality image. The jig tells the story of the simpleton Thumpkin and the Black Man, who disguise themselves as devils in order to frighten off a couple of bullies. The Black Man, by the way, is not an African, but probably a seller of black goods, such as writing ink and tinder boxes, although this isn't specified. The jig gives absolutely no musical information, but we can tell from the various changes of metre and rhythm patterns of the words that it calls for a series of 13 different tunes, and in several cases the words themselves offer us clues. If we just home in on a detail, this is the point when Thumpkin has rescued his sweetheart Susan from the clutches of the 2 bullies, and they're running away. Jog on, my pretty Susan, how likest thou my device? I think I overreached the rogues and gulled them in a trice. Now you probably recognise the words jog on from Shakespeare's Winter's Tale. It's the song sung by the ballad peddler Autolycus, which begins jog on, the footpath way. Now, it's generally agreed that in Shakespeare's play, that song is sung to a popular tune entitled Jog On, and that tune appears in an anthology entitled The English Dancing Master, published by John Playford in 1651. So, the jig, using that tune in the jig, it sounds like this. Jog on, my pretty Susan, how likest thou my device? I think I overreached the rogues and gulled them in a trice. But what happens when the jig tunes are less obvious? In these cases, sometimes the background and context of the jig can still reveal clues. This is the jig entitled Fool's Fortune, which is preserved because it featured as evidence in a libel suit brought before the Star Chamber in November 1621. You can see the manuscript is pretty damaged, and it's not laid out in separate verses, but just written right across the page. But close inspection of the text shows that, in fact, the scribe has indicated that there are 4 different tunes. He names the first one as, and I've managed to source that in notation. The second one is also named, although sadly that one is untraceable. For the third tune, the scribe has simply written to the tune of, and then left a gap, which is rather frustrating. But for the 4th tune, the scribe has written to the tune of the new mask. So what could this be? Well, I'm sure you will be familiar with the word masque. These were expensive theatrical entertainments given at the royal court, and some of their music has survived. But there are quite a lot of masques to choose from in this period, so which tune and which masque might it be? Well, if we take the word new literally, then the first thing to do is to look for a masque that was given, I suppose, not long before the date the jig was performed, which would have, in a sense, made it new at the time. Luckily, due to the fact that this jig was part of a liberal trial, we do know the exact date that the jig was first performed, the 12th of August 1621. So could this be a possible candidate? Ben Jonson's celebrated Masque of the Gypsies, which was first performed in front of James I on the 3rd of August 1621. In other words, just 9 days before the jig was given, which would certainly make it new as far as the jig writer was concerned. The masque contains several specially composed songs, but it also features a satirical ballad already in circulation at the time, a popular song entitled Cook Laurel. Now, there is quite a close relationship between ballads and jigs, which I'll talk a little about in a moment, and the Cook Laurel tune did seem a likely candidate for that reason, and indeed the words of the jig fit to it very well. Of course, we can only speculate as to whether the Masque of the Gypsies was this new masque, but it seems a possibility. In fact, the Cook Laurel ballad that was used in the masque was one of thousands of broadside ballads printed on penny song sheets that flooded the streets of London during the 17th century, and many of those turned out to be very useful when it came to searching for jig tunes. In fact, some of them take the form of a dialogue, usually between a man and a woman, a courting couple, and some of these dialogue ballads are in fact described by the printer on the broadsheet as jigs, and they're written out almost like a play script for two people to sing, with indications of who should sing what. So one can easily imagine two singers taking a role each, which might be what we see in this 17th century engraving by Laroon. And if some basic moves, dancing or acting were included, it would be a natural transition, surely, for one of these dialogue ballads to make its way from the streets onto the stage. So I'd like to end this talk with a short introduction to Singing Simpkin, which is the jig you're going to be seeing in a moment. On the 21st of October, 1595, an entry appears in the Stationer's Register. A ballad called Kemp's New Jig betwixt a soldier, a miser, and Sim the Clown. Now, you'll no doubt recognise the name Kemp as Will Kemp, the actor-clown in Shakespeare's company, who famously described himself as one that hath spent his life in mad jigs and merry jests. The entry in the Stationer's Register suggests that Kemp himself may have been the author of Singing Simpkin. We know he did write plays, although it's possible that his name was simply attached to it because he took the leading role. Sadly, Kemp's original new jig betwixt a soldier and a miser and Sim, the Clown, is lost, but what seems to be a later version of it is preserved under the title Singing Simpkin in a collection of short plays and comedies published in 1655 by Robert Cox. It's clear from the text of Singing Simpkin that it should be sung to two different tunes. Unfortunately, neither of them is named, but for the first one, I've used the tune from a broadside ballad entitled The Crossed Couple, which does have a similar metre and the right feel and fits the jig words very well. However, to identify the second tune, I had to follow a rather more complicated trail. We know that Will Kemp, who may be the jig's author, took a troupe of players on tour to the continent when he went there in the 1590s. And it may be as a result of this that Singing Simpkin exists in Dutch, German and Swedish variants. In the Dutch and German versions, the name given to the Simpkin, the clown character, is Pickle Herring, and a tune called Pickle Herring exists in 17th century Dutch sources, and it was also known in England. It fits the English words of the jig very well, so perhaps it's not unreasonable to assume that it may have been used in Singing Simpkin, and we're going to be singing it in a moment. Well, as for the plot of Singing Simpkin, it's very much in the commedia mould. I shall just outline it for you now. A young wife is lamenting her loveless state, but she's soon cheered up by the arrival of the knavish Simpkin. They quickly get down to business, but they're interrupted by the arrival of another lover, the boastful soldier Bluster, and Simpkin quickly hides himself in a chest. The old husband returns unexpectedly, and you'll recognise him by the horns on his head. Bluster, the soldier, looks for a place to hide, but since the chest, of course, is already occupied by Simpkin, the wife concocts a cunning plan. Bluster must pretend that he ran into the house because he was chasing a thief. The husband releases Simpkin from the chest and goes off to fetch him some wine to revive him, at which point Simpkin and the wife continue where they left off. Now, as I said earlier, we don't know exactly how the transition would have worked from the end of the main play into the afterpiece or the jig. So in this film, we're imagining it following a performance of Hamlet, and we come in as everyone is lying dead on the ground, and the final speech is in progress.
Let 4 captains bear Hamlet bravely like a soldier to the stage. He was likely, had he been put on, to have proved most royally. For his passage, that soldiers' music and the rites of war speak loudly for him. Take up the body. Such a sight as this becomes the field, but here shows much amiss. Go, bid the soldiers shoot.
blind Cupid hath made my heart for to bleed with a fa-la-la-la-la-la-la.
The point of a man who can help you and me with a fa-la-la-la-la-la-la.
My husband, he often hunting goes out for la 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 la.
And brings home a great pair of horns, there's no doubt.
How is Monsieur Simpkin? Why are you so sad with a fa la 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 la?
I'm up to the ears in love, and it makes me stop mad with a fa la 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 la. I'm vexed, I'm tortured, I'm troubled at heart. Fa la 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 la.
Then I'll try my skill to take off your smart with a fa la 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 la. And on that condition, I give you a kiss with a fa la 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 la.
But what says your husband when he hears of this? With a fa la 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 la.
You know my affection and no one knows more. Fa la 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 la.
Sneakers and knockers, who knocks at the door? With a fa la 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 la.
There is a moister at the door. He seems to Playhouse out.
Since you worthy friend, which is the back way out?
Mr. Asperger's welcoming and living.
I fear you'll strip me out of my skin and burn it into timber.
I've considered all the way, and 'twill be sure the best.
May it be my dearest dear.
Creep into this same chest, and though you will speak you no word, if you preserve my favour.
To the chest I pray with speed. For something has some savour.
I never shall be quiet if he use me in this fashion.
I'm here to bid you welcome. What need you by his passion?
With some young sweet-faced fellow, I thought gone out you were.
In truth, that sweet-faced fellow is kept a prisoner here.
My dearest love, with lonely men, be kindly nevermore. Instead of bumpkins, choose but me, a soldier braving war. Raised beneath the canopy of Mars, I am a valiant cavalier.
That is a lie, my friend.
Where is the fool, thy husband? Say, whither is he gone?
The whittle is a hunting.
Then we two are alone. But should he come and find me here, what might the cup of him? Perhaps he'll call the neighbours in.
And beat you till you stink.
Within this chest I'll hide myself, if he chance he should come.
Oh, no, my dear, that cannot be.
I have bespoke the room.
I have a place behind here, which yet is known to no man.
She has a place before too, that is all too common.
Why, well, what is this more, Lassar? What mean you, pray, my dear?
Alas, it is my husband.
I'm locked now till I piss.
Open the chest, I'll into it. My life must in my cost.
Alas, I cannot open it.
I believe the key is
I have considered all the way. I found some dainty trick.
Oh, it may be, my dearest love. Prithee now, be quick.
You must say that your enemy into this house is fled, and that your heart will take no rest until that he be dead. Draw quickly out your furious blade and seek to make a strike. Then all the excuses that are heard will not preserve his life. Swear that the rogue that fled in here that stole away your coin, and if I'll not deliver him, you'll have as much of mine.
But there's no man in here but me. On whom should I complain?
This great fool doesn't understand. This thing you must but feign. My husband must not be deceived, and afterwards we'll laugh.
Why, since you will not open the door, I'll take out with my staff.
Good woman, show me through the road. His limbs I straight will tear.
My heart, the honesty I have, there's no man naked here.
When I have fought to purchase wealth and with my blood did win it, this rogue hath got my purse by stealth.
with never a penny in it.
Poor heavens, what is this I see here? A sword drawn in my home.
Oh, husband, I'm frightened.
I wish I were alone.
I swear I never pardoned him on holy sacrament.
Upon my soul, I was outside and missed him as he went. As she speak with child, therefore take heed, you do not fright my wife.
But know you who the father is?
The roarer on my line.
She knows not of your enemy, then get you gone to a best.
Peace, husband, peace. I'll tell you true. I've hid him in the chest.
I'm glad on't in my heart, but do not tell him so.
I would not for £1,000 the roarer shouldn't know.
When next we meet, his life is gone, no other may he hold. I'll kill the rogue when air comes on!
Pray think upon the road.
What kind of person is it that in the chest do lie?
A goodly, handsome, sweet young man as e'er was seen with eye.
Then let us both entreat of him, pray put us not in fear. We do beseech him, go from hence.
But tomorrow I'll be here.
Fight down with all the speed you can and quickly shut the door. I would not that the roaring man should come here any more. Meantime I will release the youth, tell him how we've sped. Be comforted, my honest friend.
My heart is tortured in my breast with sorrow, fear and pain.
I'll fetch some aqua vita to comfort your dear.
And cause I will require you to love doth so excel. I'll graft a pair of horns on your head that may defend it well.
Good husband, let the man stay here. 'Tis dangerous in the streets.
I would not for a crown of gold the roarer should he need. For should he come to any harm, they'd say the fault was mine.
His half a crown. Pray send him out to fetch a quart of wine.
Here's money for you, sir. Pray fetch a quart of sack.
'Tis well, my honest friend. I'll see you shall not lack.
But if he should dishonest me, for there are such slippery men.
Then he gets not of his half crown 1 penny back again.
Thy husband be he gone, my love. We'll sing, we'll dance, we'll laugh. I'm sure he is a good fellow who does delight to quaff.
I'll fold you in my arms, my love, no matter for his listening.
A gentleman, some 40 weeks hence, you may come to a christening.
Sir, have I caught you? Now do the best you can. Your schoolmaster now taught you to wrong an honest man.
Good sir, I never went to school, so why am I thus abused? The truth is, I am but a fool, and like a fool am used.
But, Sarah, you had wit enough to think to cuckold me.
I jested with him, husband. His knavery to see.
Well, now you talk of knavery, I pray, where is my sack?
Oh, you want it in your belly, sir, and have it on your back. There.